Hello. Just pray. Lord, I thank you for your presence with us today. And thank you that you're in everything that you have made. I pray that you would be in this time of teaching as much as you've been in the worship. And Lord, to speak to us as only you can. And let us forget the things that aren't needed. But Lord, speak truth to us. So I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about today because many years ago we used to just choose whatever we wanted to talk about. And then we've been going through series for a while. And I thought, oh, I get to just choose what I'm going to talk about today. And I was thinking, I've been reading quite a lot of really good books recently. I say quite a lot. I've been reading 2 books really slowly, but they've had a lot of good stuff in them. But as I was thinking about it, I couldn't really quite get is there a big theme that's going on that God's talking to me about? I wasn't quite sure. But then I started to think about a couple of things that I'd read in one of these books. And it kept coming to mind. And I had a little pray about it and I had a picture from God. I thought, okay. And then I was reminded of the verses that I felt that God gave me at the beginning of the year. And I really felt like it was time to really revisit them and really ponder over them again. So today I'm going to kind of mix those 3 things together. But I think that they really do intertwine. So I hope I'm not just speaking to myself today. But if I am, thank you very much because it's been a good week. But yeah, so the passage we're going to look at today is Exodus chapter 33, verse 7 to 17. So I'll read that out to begin with. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up, and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship, each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to a friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you, in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?" So just to give you a little bit of context, this comes just after the golden calf, when Moses went up to receive from God and the people turned away from him so very quickly. And after that, God said, "I'm not going with you. You can go into the promised land, but I'm not going with you." And that's why Moses is saying, if you won't go with us, we're not going. Now, when I received this passage in January, it was just a really good reminder of God's presence and that it's available to us. and how precious that is, and that we need to seek it out. This time I was reading it, I was really struck by this idea of the tent of meeting. We call it the tent of meeting. It hadn't really occurred to me before, but in this story here, this isn't the tabernacle. So this isn't the mobile temple that God told Moses to build and gave him the plans for, and they built it in the wilderness, and the people all donated things to make it. This was just a tent which Moses set up so that he could be with God, and like he had been up on the mountain. And it was a place where he could inquire of God for the people. So once the tabernacle was constructed, God would meet with Moses and his people there. Now, God's presence, even in this little tent, this tent of meeting, was tangible, and it was announced by the big pillar of cloud. And all those who saw it glorified God. Now, in our own lives, we might not have a tangible pillar of cloud, but we have all experienced the presence of God, and it is precious. And when we experience it, it inspires us and others to glorify God, just like it does in this story. Now, this tent of meeting was outside the camp. And in some ways, when I first read this, I thought, oh yeah, it reminds me of the way that Jesus used to go off on his own to spend time with God. And it can be a good reminder of the importance of taking time to do the same. But then as I was looking at it this time, I realized that this location for a tent of meeting was not what God ultimately intended. So when he did the tabernacle, when that was constructed, it was placed in the midst of the camp. It was for all to be in reach of. Now, my study Bible has suggested that this location for the tent outside the camp is due to the fact that the Israelites had just complained against God, turned completely away from him. And he had said that he wouldn't go with them anymore. So there was this disconnect between God and his people. And maybe the positioning of this tent outside the camp was a reflection of this disconnect. But the really good news for us that we can't forget is that there is no such disconnect between us and God, between believers and God today. Because all has already been forgiven and all has already been paid for. And God does want to be right in our midst, right in the midst of our lives. It says in the Bible, so we've got to believe it, that nothing can separate us from him any longer. And we don't have to go far to find him. So the next part of this passage goes on to talk about Moses challenging God to make himself known to him and to send his presence with the Israelites as they move forward. And I do find this quite an encouraging section. Moses says to God, "You have been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." And we have just heard that Moses, he meets with God face to face, and God knows him by name, and Moses has found favor with God. And yet Moses still needs to ask God for clarity. And he still needs to ask God, who are you going to send with me? He doesn't think he's got to do it on his own. Who are you going to bring with me to do this? And he still has to ask for more understanding of God's ways so that he can continue to please him. You see, sometimes I think the church has fallen into the trap of thinking either that we know it all or that we're supposed to know it all. But that's not really how it's presented in the Bible at all. The people who were the closest to God kept getting surprised by him, and they kept growing in their understanding of him, and they kept getting humbled when they got it wrong. So these aren't things that we need to avoid or be ashamed of, because actually they are part of living alongside an awesome God. Now, in response, God does agree to go with the people of Israel. And again, it's that like encouragement of you can speak like that with God. We can debate things with him. And God says, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Now, when I felt this passage was, God was giving me this passage for the year, that verse really stuck out to me. I think I said in January when I talked about it, because I'd heard that at a women's conference and a woman had got us singing it in a round. And I was like, oh, what a wonderful phrase that I thought she'd said. And then when I came to it, I was like, oh, it's from the Bible. What a wonderful verse. And this is a verse I think we would do well to carry with us in life, to remind us that we never have to go it alone. And I was thinking, like, we have times in the tent of meeting, we have times in the quiet place, and that is really good. And they kind of charge us up for going out into the world. But it's not that God stays in the tent. It's not that God stays in that place. His presence goes with us in what we do too. And it reminds me a little of something I heard recently, which links to Psalm 23, about how God's goodness and mercy, and it says they follow us all the days of our lives. We shouldn't have this image of this like sentimental goodness that kind of follows us around, or like a little puppy. But that word follow is to pursue, to attend closely upon, or like in that song, it's running after us. God and his goodness and his mercy, they don't just leave it to us. They don't just leave us to it in this life. He's with us every single step of the way. And this rest that God offers us in this verse, and so I think it does refer to that final rest that Israel were looking forward to that in the promised land. But that was just a foreshadowing of the final rest that will come when his kingdom comes. But I think it also speaks to us of something more immediate, of a sense of rest that we can have in our days now as we give our burdens to him. So after having this really beautiful promise from God, it's almost a little bit funny how Moses replies. He says, well, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? It's almost like he's a bit sassy with God in that bit, I think. But what he says is really true, because we can't go anywhere without God. How else will anyone know that we are any different from anyone else? How else are we supposed to be doing things and living in a way that is completely different from what the world teaches us if he's not with us? It just can't be done without him. And I've heard a few people speaking about the passage in the Old Testament when it describes how the tent of meeting, so the tabernacle now, that had a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Whenever the pillar of cloud raised up, then the Israelites would pack up their camp and they'd follow it. And whenever it descended again, they would set up camp in that place. And those verses, it repeats it over and over again. When it comes down, they camp. When it goes up, they go. And they just do whatever they're led to do. It says it over and over again. But the point it's making is they only went with God. They didn't go ahead and they didn't lag behind. They went where and when his presence led them. And I think that is something that it would be good for us to remember, for me to remember. If you think about it with a logical head on, they probably could have got to the promised land much quicker if they just sorted it out themselves, if they'd followed their own schedule, if they'd just got on with it. But what would have been the point if God had not been with them? So back to the tent of meeting. We said this little tent of meeting was a foreshadowing of the tabernacle. And God, he instigates the construction of the tabernacle in Exodus 25. And he says, have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. It is the place where God's presence is manifested. It is where heaven and earth meet. It is a place to meet with God. And then when David is king and there's time of rest from war, he is settled in a palace, he inquires of Nathan about what he should do for God. Now that he has a palace, should the ark still live in a tent? When God's response to Nathan is that he has had a house, the tabernacle, since the Exodus, and he has been with David and the people of Israel wherever they have gone. And I almost get the impression that God likes it that way, that the tabernacle went with the people and the people went with the tabernacle, that God was with them wherever they went. And a static temple, it kind of brings new challenges with it. It could be less accessible geographically for some people. It was tied to the land that they were in at that time. And the building itself could become more of a focus than what it was meant to represent. But God does bless the idea of the temple. As we see many times as we read through the Bible, there are different seasons through history. We see it today. There are different seasons through history, but God somehow manages to connect with us in all of them. And God declares that Solomon will construct the temple as he is a king in a season of rest. And when Solomon builds the temple and dedicates it, God's glory fills it. Now, the story of Israel does not run smoothly, of course, and the temple is destroyed and the people are taken into captivity, and it's later rebuilt. And the people of Israel return. But many of the generation who remember that first temple weep when they see the new one, because they know it doesn't compare with the original. So that's just a little bit of background. But I found it really, really fascinating recently. I've finally finished Paul's biography by Tom Wright. And it just talks about how the Israelites saw that temple and what it means for us. Because according to Tom Wright, despite the fact that the Israelites had returned to Jerusalem and they'd rebuilt a temple, they didn't really feel like they'd been fully restored. They did not feel that God had filled the temple with his glory once more. And they were waiting. They were waiting for God to come among them again. And they were waiting for the promises to the line of David to be fulfilled. But then both of these things came to be in one man. When the New Testament talks about all the fullness of God being glad to dwell in Jesus, this is using temple language. God has come among his people once more, but this time not in a building, but in a person. Jesus is where heaven and earth meet. Jesus is the place where people get to meet with God. And even better than that, he's the temple, but he's also the high priest, and he's also the sacrifice. In Jesus, we see God, we meet with God, we're represented before God, and we're reconciled with God, so that we can stand before him like never before. And I really love that, thinking about that afresh, just how much better Jesus is than a building, and what a wonderful plan God had. But it gets even better than that, because as Tom Wright explains, Jesus now lives in us. We have Christ in us, the hope of glory. We are where heaven and earth meet, and we are where we can meet with God. So instead of having somewhere we need to go to meet with God, a tent or a tabernacle or a temple, or even to meet the person of Jesus, we get to meet him here. Now, of course, there's a lot of good stuff in the Bible about us collectively as a church being the body of Christ and being the house of God. And that's really important to remember. You know, Christ is the cornerstone and we are living stones making up that building together. And this is really important. This is good. We do need each other. And we do host God in such a wonderful way as a church body. But the fact that when we need to meet with God, he is right here, that he has made his home not just on earth, but in us, is incredibly important. It's precious. And it's really, really important we remind ourselves of that. Now, just one final thing. So as I was praying about what I was going to talk about today, I got this picture of like a very precious stone, a treasure. And I was reminded just again of how precious this gift is that we have in us, that God lives in us. But I was also reminded of that verse in 2 Corinthians, which says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." Now, that verse is talking about the treasure of the gospel, but I think it rings true just as much when we consider that God lives in us. Because I think we can all get tripped up sometimes on thinking that we're not good enough, or that maybe that we've messed up something too badly, or that we're not doing a good enough job of representing God in our lives. So how could he be in us? But what I've been learning a lot recently is that God has never been interested in us looking like we had it together. It's not on his list. All the disciples fell short at times. Paul got beaten up many times and he'd walk into the next town, black and blue, looking like a failure, and he'd preach God there. He'd preach Jesus there. And Jesus died a really shameful death. So obviously these things are no barrier to God's presence or to our mission of representing God to others. I believe that all God is looking for is an open door and an open heart. He just wants a place to meet with us and us with him, wherever we may be. You can do it in church, you can do it in your quiet space, but you can do it wherever, because he's always there. And when we do this, as well as having him for ourselves, which is the biggest gift we could ever have, we also are able to reflect God's presence out into the world. We can be that tent of meeting. We can be that temple. The Bible even says we get to be the priests to others, to connect them with heaven. And that was always God's plan for his people. And it's his plan for us. But as I said, we have this treasure in jars of clay. And that jar of clay is not an excuse. And it's not something to beat ourselves up about. Because this precious treasure we have, it's got nothing to do with who we are. It's got nothing to do with how well we look like we've got it all together in our lives, or how we look like we're getting it right. It's all about the fact that we have him in us. That nothing less than God has made his home in us. I finished with a prayer. Ah, God, I thank you that you are more than enough. You've already done it all. And we can learn more and get deeper with you all the time. But the most important thing is that you are good and you are God and you're with us. We know what love is because we've seen who you are. I thank you that we have come to know you. Thank you that you paid the price for us. Lord, help us to be the place where heaven and earth meets. Help this place, our family, our church family, to be the place where heaven and earth meets, and where more people will see you and be able to meet with you and hear from you, and your kingdom will be established.